you so much, Torsten, and thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here to share some of the work that I have been developing since I wrote the book that Torsten mentioned. Let me go ahead and pull up my slides here. All right. Yes, so my topic for today is redressing colonial knowledge systems through restorative data justice. And this really grows out of my research on Algeria. And as Torsten mentioned, I began that research by looking at the French colonial period and how French colonization began there, and how politicians, military officials really utilized what they saw in the United States as a very unfortunate example of how you go about establishing a settler colony, and how you use policies and military force to push back the indigenous population. So you'll see some echoes of that work in what I'll talk about today. That work then led me into my second project, which examined the Ottoman period of Algerian history. And this is a really fascinating moment in Algeria's past, but there's not a whole lot written about it, in large part because the sources are really disparate, they're fragmentary, especially as you get outside of Algiers proper. And I was really focusing on the eastern province of Algeria, the province of Constantine, because in my first trip to the archives studying the French colonial period, I ran across the memoir of the last Ottoman governor of Constantine. It was absolutely fascinating. In over 40 pages, he documented all of the political upheavals, the attempted coups, how he came to become governor in the first place. And I became really fascinated by his story and began to ask questions about how representative he was, because this was such a unique, rich source. I wondered if there were other governors like him, how his experience compared. And of course, when we begin to ask questions about representativeness, this leads us very naturally into statistics, at least for those of us who are math nerds like I am. But to study his representativeness from a computational standpoint, I needed a data set. And so that's where the second project really grew from, is developing this data set and then discovering other members of the governor's family, beginning to examine them through social network analysis. So I'll talk about these two pieces of the project today, but I'm also going to situate them in a larger context as I have been thinking about how my experience in this one location apply to the work that others are doing elsewhere as we address data and source materials that are coming out of colonial contexts. So you are welcome to get in touch with me if you have any questions. You can find me on LinkedIn. So it's linkedin.com and then the rest of that address there. I'll also let me quickly grab a link to these slides and I'll drop these right in chat. That way you can click on these links without a problem. All right, so here is the link to these slides if you are curious and want to know more. You can click those links. My email address is there. It's kind of long, so it's simpler to simply copy and paste it. I'm on Instagram, but not a whole lot these days, but you'll find some teasers about some of my research there. Hopefully I can get that up and running again. So during the 1830 French conquest, which I briefly mentioned, witnesses watched aghast as French officers looted administrative buildings and soldiers used official Ottoman documents to light their pipes. In the following years, the plunder continued until most of the official records from Algiers and neighboring cities were either lost or stolen or destroyed. The case of Algeria, which was a palimpsest of overlapping Berber, Roman, Arab, Ottoman, and then French legacies, highlights the problematic nature of colonial and colonized archives and the question of what decolonizing data means in such a context. So my sources are varied. As I mentioned, the materials from the Ottoman period are rather fragmentary. So I use a combination of French and Algerian chronicles of the governors' lives and their reign, travel narratives, often from Europeans who are traveling through Algeria, diplomatic correspondence, which I'm beginning to plumb here in France. That's been really an exciting way to expand what I've already done, and a few surviving Ottoman registers. And I can talk more about the problems with those registers that do still exist in a moment. I also have looked at some of the commercial records from the French coral concessions. These were concessions from the Ottoman Empire to France to be able to do fishing along the coast of Algeria and set up stations in a couple of cities. So through close reading and structured notes and developing a custom context-specific classification schema, I reconstructed the data sets on the governors of Ottoman Algeria, specifically the province of Constantine, for prosopographical study. This reconstruction does not simply reconstitute imperial ontologies, but rather seeks to describe these men and women with categories that they themselves would have likely employed. So I argue that historical data set construction or reconstruction is not the only way, but it is one way that we can begin to address some of the voids in the archive. Similarly, we can use text mining to identify both named and unnamed entities, and use social network analysis to illustrate and study their relationships. So in my own work, I examine unnamed women's spectral presence, their ghostly presence, and argue that they can be recovered to some extent and represented despite their absence in the archival record. This painting here is by Horace Vernet from the Siege of Constantine in 1837. And this is when many of the documents in Constantine specifically were lost and destroyed because the palace was ransacked after this very ferocious battle. It actually took France many years to finally conquer Constantine, but once they did, they destroyed much of the Ottoman documents and the material record in the palace. So I argue hand in hand, these techniques, such as prosopography or social network analysis, allow us to reassemble data that has been lost in the violence of colonial conquest and to resurrect the stories, if not always the voices, of the men and women long silenced. In this way, we can subvert colonial weapons of quantification and convert them into tools for restitution. So this is what I'm calling restorative data justice. It's a theoretical framework I propose for our consideration today. I present restorative data justice as a response to both common historical challenges we face when we're undertaking the studies of marginalized populations, especially when we're using colonial archives, and it's a response to this present moment, this era of capitalistic datafication and increasingly urgent calls for social change and justice. I argue that this concept of restorative data justice may serve as a bridge. My apologies. My screen just jumped. So I argue that restorative data justice may serve as a bridge between historical studies and work on current data cultures. So it offers one way to redress this problematic past of colonial knowledge production and its legacy in information structures and systems that are still at work today in this present age of capitalistic surveillance and widespread data misuse. As I present this concept in greater detail, you'll notice that it describes processes that many of us already use, but frames them in a way that will be legible to non-historians as well, with the hope that this framework can do work both in and outside of the historical context, as well as in and outside of the academy. And just as important, this framework addresses our current reality of doing history particularly in the American context. I can't speak to the European context, but certainly in the American context, in neoliberal educational institutions where we need to justify the value of our research and teaching, even the value of our subject. It translates historians' modes of thought and practice in ways that demonstrate how they may also be applied to understand pressing issues in the era of big data. So, as I alluded to, sources that relate to colonized territories and people often have problematic provenances, and those from and about Ottoman Algeria are no exception. The first challenge is that such sources are almost exclusively written by the colonizers. And the second is that the archive is often fragmentary, replete with gaps and silences in the extant collections. So as I've mentioned, many of the records from Ottoman Algeria were destroyed or removed. And unfortunately, those that were removed often ended up in private archives and have since been lost to public view. And as you might be familiar with Rupika Rassam's work, she writes, European colonial cultures are data cultures, and data is a raw material for empire. So I really began kind of thinking about this idea as I was wrapping up my book. And so as I pondered this palimpsest of Ottoman and then French colonization in Algeria, I began to reframe this erasure of Ottoman documents, and watching them literally go up in smoke during the conquest as a way of the French Empire attempting to erase the previous imperial presence. They were attempting to establish themselves by distancing Algeria from its Ottoman past, by destroying the records that bore witness to that past. So the silencing of Ottoman records, even though they attempted, it could not really erase that past. So in spite of French administrators' desire to remove all traces of preceding rulers in order to draw a clear line of connection directly between ancient Rome and their holdings in North Africa and French holdings in North Africa in the 19th century, the built environment and the mixed ethnicity descendants of Ottoman Algerian families persisted and testified to a past that the French wanted to forget. So with this background in mind, I'm going to briefly define the notion of data justice as it is being used among information, media, and communication studies scholars today, and then present a definition for restorative data justice within and for historical studies. So data justice is, as you see on the screen here, a concept, a framework, an approach, and a practice. It can be used to challenge dominant understandings of the world, to create or recreate conditions for counter-imaginaries, and to advance social justice claims. And this comes from a book by the same title, from a book called Data Justice. As a concept, data justice emerges from critical data studies, information science, media studies, and brings together critiques and historical context from the humanities and social sciences. As a framework, data justice examines data issues in the context of historical legacies, existing power dynamics, ideology, and social practices. And it highlights how data systems and infrastructure perpetuate or create varying and often unequal effects across different communities, with particular attention paid to communities that have been marginalized in the past or the present. So this approach of data justice is radical in that it seeks to destabilize the appearance of natural order, to reveal contemporary power relations, and it considers how they could be different. As a practice, data justice fosters and it also operationalizes the idea that data can be used to, quote, challenge dominant understandings of the world, to create or recreate conditions of possibility for counter-imaginaries and advance social justice claims, end quote. So while data justice acknowledges that injustices are rooted in specific historic contexts, it generally problematizes present data gathering, and use and reuse practices. So in this talk, I'm going to link these conversations that are more presentist to our work as historians and present restorative data justice as an extension and application of critical data studies to historical research in and on Indigenous communities and the Global South. So restorative data justice occurs in sort of a three-step process, or at least this is how I'm beginning to frame it. I welcome your ideas and expansions and suggestions, questions, to really make this idea solid and applicable across many different studies. So data justice is a way to promote reparation to the cognitive injustice that fails to recognize non-mainstream ways of knowing the world through data. So as we think about how we enact this notion of restorative data justice, we first take a look at our sources as data. Sometimes we actually have tabular data that we can start with, but often we don't. And so one of the very first steps is, especially when we're trying to create or recreate data that has been lost to time, we then need to start looking at our sources in a slightly different way and generate data from them, specifically on and about people who have been marginalized. And this goes beyond kind of reading, either along the grain or against the grain. Here we're doing reading with a very specific purpose to uncover information that we have defined as valuable about people who have been marginalized in some way. Often then we need to create our own ontology that's informed by local epistemologies and not those of imperial knowledge structures. And this is a really important move because often, especially if we have at least some tabular data to begin working with, it's really easy to replicate those column names, those variable descriptions that come directly from a colonial context. So I'm going to ask us to take it one step farther and do some really deep thinking about what we know about the context, about the people that we're studying, and how would they have defined themselves? How would they describe themselves? Rather than simply pulling in the descriptions and definitions from the colonial context. And then finally, conducting our analyses of that data in ethically and historically responsible ways that highlight the experiences and roles. Again, if not the voices, sometimes we can't access those, but we can at least highlight some of the experiences of those who've been marginalized. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to talk about two methods that I've used to go about enacting these ideas of restorative data justice. The first is prosopography, and by using prosopography, or this method of creating a collective biography, what I'm essentially doing is recreating the lost Ottoman records about the governors. The Ottomans kept very careful records for the empire and about all of the individuals who served as administrators. Unfortunately for Constantine, those records have since been lost. So I'm constructing them anew, again, with a sense of the historical context of the time, how people would have understood and described themselves. So that was the first method. And then the other one I'll talk about is social network analysis, particularly how we deal with gaps in our data and people who are mentioned, but aren't necessarily named in the sources. So I'm curious as I began to dive into prosopography, and I'll show you a snippet from the data set in just a moment so that we can actually get a concrete example of what this looks like in practice, and I can talk through some of my decision making. I also want to mention some of the critiques of this approach. And so I've been kind of thinking about what are the affordances, what are the limitations of creating a data set and enumerating people in this way. And I agree that there are some problematic elements of quantifying human beings. Certainly when we're talking about looking at people who were enslaved, this enumeration often replicates some of the systems of surveillance and control over human bodies and human people and lives. And we need to bring that to bear as we work with our data, as we talk about our data, describe it, document it, and share it, and be sensitive to the ways that this method has been used against people in the past. And some of the scholars who have talked about these challenges or this inherent tension as we work with data about marginalized people. I think specifically of Jessica Marie Johnson in her 2018 article, Markup Bodies, Black Life Studies, and Slavery Death Studies. And she argues that if we take a data-driven approach as we're studying the lives of people who are enslaved, that we may replicate racist terms and ideologies in new digital formats, especially if we simply bring those tables, those data sets from the past into the present in a new digital age. And yes, we do, to some extent, need to keep the original sources as they were, because we can interrogate the way, the vocabulary that people used and how they were thinking at the time. It's a historical artifact. But then when we go to work with that data in our own way, I think that's a moment where we can pause and reconfigure that data set in a way that honors the people whose lives we're studying, so that we don't replicate, as Jessica Marie Johnson writes, we don't replicate the surveilling actions, the vocabulary, the terms of those who had power over the marginalized populations we're examining. The other piece of this that I think is really important that Jessica Marie Johnson points to is she highlights the importance of the humanistic analysis of the data. We have to have that piece of it too. If not, she writes that the data then may further obscure the social and political lives of those who've been captured in that data. So there are two elements here in terms of thinking about how we structure our data, how we define our variables, the classes or categories we're using to describe particularly people, and then making sure that we do the next step and do that analysis that contextualizes all of this. So here is a snippet of my data that I've put together on these governors. It doesn't include all of the variables, but it gives you at least a sense of what's in there. So I have the transliterated name for each of the governors beginning in 1567, and this data set runs to 1837, so it represents quite a vast expanse of time. I also wanted to make sure I included the Arabic script spelling of each person's name so that if I do run across their names somewhere in some of the original text sources, I can identify them more easily. I have the starting and ending dates for their tenures in office, their length of time in office, and then the variable I want to discuss just briefly, meditate on, is this next column, which I originally defined as ethnicity for lack of a better term. And then the final one is fate. But ethnicity was particularly challenging because at the time, you had Ottoman administrators who were coming from throughout the Ottoman Empire. Some of them were Europeans who were taken in a tax system called devshirme, where Christian families would basically have to give up one of their sons to the Ottoman administration to be trained up and become either a bureaucrat or a military leader. So some of them were from Ottoman extraction, Others were Turkish, ethnically Turkish, which is really fascinating because that was quite unusual. Most Ottoman administrators were not Turkish, and very intentionally not Turkish, because the Sultan was very concerned about giving power to Turkish families. And so the Sultan was trying to keep that divide between his rule and those who served under him and make a very clear distinction. But in Algeria, Algeria was kind of on the frontier. And so there, he was actually more willing to send the sons from Turkish families to serve as administrators and in the military there. So you can see this ethnicity, this notion of ethnicity gets very complicated. And even for those who were European, were they Georgian or were they Greek? Where were they coming from? And so I've decided to instead define this as origins. And I have more columns of data where I can specify exactly where people came from, anything I know about their families to give me some sense of their possible ethnicity. And I decided to simplify, yes, I decided to simplify this in this column so I could make a clear distinction between Ottoman, Algerian, and then the mixed ethnicity governors known as Kululus. So they were the sons of Ottoman administrators and Algerian women. And by doing so, then I could do statistical analysis. But like I said, I do have those other columns to provide that much more specific, nuanced information about where they're coming from. But also my term Algerian is not exactly precise because at the time, those who would have called themselves Algerian would have come from the city of Algiers. Others would have referred to themselves by their tribal affiliation. So I have yet another column for tribal affiliation where it's known, so that in other columns in the data set, I can get much more precise about who these people were and how they would have described themselves. Yes, and I saw the note in chat, heart for OSF. Yes, OSF is Open Science Framework. I love their system. It's where I've put all of my data for this project. It has version control. The other thing I love about this is a really good moment to highlight. I had a couple of graduate students who helped me either put the data set together or validate it, both this one and the one for the social network analysis. And in Open Science Framework, I could highlight their contributions and describe which parts of the project they worked on and attach their names to the actual data that they helped to construct and be very clear about their contributions. So yes, I love Open Science Framework as well. It's free. I highly recommend it. All right, so I've mentioned social network analysis a few times. I'm going to briefly talk about my process because this is quite replicable. I still have dreams of finishing up a Python script that I started years ago to do this automatically. Now with the advances in neural net, I think we can actually do this in a way that isn't quite as cumbersome. I was trying to develop a rule-based system, which is very, very, very difficult in unstructured language, because as you can see here, sometimes the references aren't always, sometimes they're right next to each other, but you see these vertical lines with no arrows attached to them. That's because we had to link to a previous reference, sometimes several sentences, sometimes multiple pages before to figure out who was who. So, but this process, it's a bit time intensive, and this is where my graduate students were really helpful in literally mapping out these relationships. Because if I was just curious about the named individuals, this wouldn't have been so cumbersome. We could have simply used named entity recognition, NER, and extracted those names and figured out how they were related. But as I mentioned, what I also wanted to do is capture the people who were not named but referenced in the text, because often those were women. and I really wanted to develop a social network that was as complete as possible. And of course, we needed to have women in there who married into these families, had children, their children then married other people. So what I used is a tool called Recogito. This is also free. And it does the named entity recognition piece for you, which is really nice. And then you can go through and validate that. The other thing it does is it not only identifies people, but if you're curious about a geographical analysis, you'll see this highlight in green on Tunis. It also identifies places, and it will give you a map. And within the map, you can click on the locations and it will pop up a bit of information, and it will pull the text that references that place. Right. So I saw the note in chat. I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. So as I mentioned, we mapped all of the relationships. The other nice feature in Recogito is then you can download nodes and edges lists that you can port right into Gephi, social network analysis tool. So what we did is we extracted that information and then brought that into Gephi after we added some additional information to each of the nodes. So we added tribal affiliation, gender information, which was super important for my analysis, as well as several other things. So I think I've got a snippet of that. Yes, I do. I have a snippet of that I can show you in just a moment. So I did an analysis of the social network, and as I was going through this, yes, there were many women who weren't named in the sources, but a few were named, and their stories were really hard to ignore. The more I excavated my source material, the more women I found whose lives stood in stark contrast to popular modern perceptions of Algerian women. Some women assumed command of local militias, others served as trusted political advisors, and one even became the head of a tribe into which she had married. So clearly the women whose stories made it into the chronicles were exceptional. And the reason I wanted to highlight the unnamed women is to get at this question of what about the women who weren't as exceptional, who weren't named in the sources, whose stories we don't know a whole lot about, but can we tell something about their lives by doing a structural analysis of the social networks? So this is just a really quick graphic. I won't get into the details of what we're seeing here other than to point out the first graph is one of only named individuals in the source materials. The second graph includes both named individuals and those who are referenced in the text, even if their names didn't appear. And then the final step in this process was to add in people who clearly were part of the social network, but didn't appear in the text at all. The most common case where we could use inference is when we had a father and son. Clearly, there had to be a woman involved in bringing that son into the world. And so we added mostly women in where it was apparent that they were part of that family, whether or not they were wives or concubines. Normally, they were wives in Algeria. So we added them in as well. And so I know this looks like a really tiny graph, and it is, especially for the extent of time that it covers. We have 182 nodes total. But by the end, in this three-step process, we ended up with, wasn't quite 50-50, but 38% to 62% women to men ratio. And again, this isn't just about playing with the numbers. This is about trying to create a social network graph that's as complete as possible, because the more complete the network graph is, the better our analytics stemming from it will be, the more robust they'll be. So here's the data set that ended up going into Gephi. So you can see we've got the node ID, their label. This is their name when it's known. Otherwise, you'll see references like sister-in-law of Boudiaf. That's how she's referenced in the materials, and so that is how we have to know her as. And then we have the Arabic script where known, gender, again, ethnicity. I want to change this to origins again. The ID method, because I wanted to study what impact this process had on my analysis. And then, of course, tribal affiliation. Yes, so one of the questions that just popped up in chat was, no, you're not supposed to see the Gephi window. I'll have a map for you in just a moment. One of the questions that just came up in the chat was if I've consulted the Osmanli archive in Istanbul, the Ottoman archive there. I went through their finding aids and records, and they really don't have much on Algeria. Algeria was such a frontier region that any of the Ottoman records about the administration and their documents, they were all kept pretty much in Algeria, other than a few letters exchanged back and forth. Yeah, so unfortunately that wasn't as productive as I'd hoped, and there certainly wasn't. There was a little bit on Algiers in terms of letters that were sent, but practically nothing on Constantine. Yeah, really, really good question. Okay, so I mentioned that some of the women's stories did emerge from the source materials, and they were named so I could actually tease out, okay, what were the lives like for some of these women who are showing up in my network? And so I'll share one story, and then we'll come back to one other that are quite illustrative. So in 1724, two Ottoman governors, one from Algeria and the other from Tunisia, combined forces and set out to bring the rebellious Algerian tribes to heel. In the eastern province of Constantine, they successfully took the mutinous tribe by surprise. In the midst of defeat, Sheikh Bouaziz prepared 8,000 head of cattle and goods to turn over to the Ottoman conquerors. This would have broken this tribe. So before he could deliver the property, his daughter, Algia, mounted her horse and rallied both the men and the women to attack the Turkish army. And together, the combined forces of men and women drove the Turks into a hasty retreat and took the Ottoman lieutenant governor captive. Songs and oral traditions of this tribe, the Hainanecha, recorded in the mid-19th century, more than a century after her brave efforts, still recalled her heroism. And Algia is, as I mentioned, not the only remarkable woman. So as I examined the analytics coming out of the graph, I decided to take a look at a number of measures. Today, I'm just going to talk about betweenness centrality. I'm happy to talk about some of my more recent work using some other methods along with statistical analysis. But betweenness centrality really revealed the role of women. So as I began this study, I was really interested in exploring kinship connections. And those can be investigated meaningfully using the quantitative network metrics, such as betweenness centrality scores. And these scores highlight the individuals who served as essential bridges between people, between family units, and sociopolitical cliques. So in the graph here, 12 of the top 26 individuals, or 46%, are women, which is a proportion that is higher than the general proportion of women to men in the graph, which, as you'll recall, is about 38%. Of these 12 women, half of them are unnamed but explicitly referenced in the documents. What I discovered is generations of interconnections formed powerful Ottoman Algerian indigenous ruling families, through which access to local power was transmitted through women rather than solely from father to son. So marrying into elite Algerian families enabled Ottoman officials to advance their careers and preserve their positions of power, in large part due to the influence of their Algerian in-laws. The historical literature has largely ignored such connections and the role of women in creating avenues to high provincial offices. So an exploration of unnamed women's kinship connections who appear in between the centrality scores above bears out these findings. As one example, I took a deep dive into one family that was in power for almost a century. So it began with Bu Hanek. You'll see here is in blue. He was an Ottoman administrator who arrived in 1736, and he was tasked with quelling some of the rebellions. And after attempting this militarily, he was not having much luck. And so eventually, out of desperation, he goes to the head of the tribe that is rebelling and asks for the tribal chief's daughter's hand in marriage. The chief agrees. I don't know if his sister-in-law, the sister-in-law of the chief, was a disagreeable person, if he was trying to get rid of her, but she ended up marrying the Ottoman administrator as well. I don't know if it was a way to remove her from the tribe, or perhaps there were other reasons. Maybe she brought land or power, I'm not sure. Anyway, the Ottoman governor ended up marrying these two women from this tribe, and the rebellions ceased. So this practice was repeated multiple times in Algeria. When military efforts failed, usually marriage won the day. And what we see here is then the daughters of these relationships then go on to marry subsequent Ottoman administrators who come in. And they really have an advantage because not only do they speak Arabic, or perhaps even a Berber language, the daughters of these marriages now also speak Ottoman Turkish and are also trained to read and write. So they become highly desirable women to marry. They're also quite wealthy because the daughters who married these governors came from wealthy families. Their wealth accumulated with that marriage. And finally, we end up with Deka, who is also a mixed ethnicity daughter of these marriages, who marries Abdallah Bey, who becomes governor in 1804. And Deka is interesting because she became a highly placed advisor to the council of the governor. Whenever they had a problem they couldn't solve, she was actually the one that they came to ask for her advice. And the whole community mourned her death when she passed. So in this way, I've offered a couple of methods here. There are, of course, many others that could be used to enact this notion of restorative data justice, of replacing, or not replacing, but resituating people who've been lost in history, who have been on the margins of both historical analysis or perhaps even forgotten by time, of placing them back into the story. So we begin to restore them to our historical narratives. In this case, with the study using social network analysis, we can do that whether or not they were explicitly named in the sources. If they were merely referenced, now we've got some tools to begin to flesh out what their experiences might have been like and what were their roles in this history. So as I've mentioned, this isn't a perfect solution, but sadly, such an imaginary ideal does not and cannot exist. I wish I had a magic wand to wave, but I don't. And in many ways, this is not truly reparative, but it is a step in the right direction. What is more, we have the way that we've represented women in the data sets and the social network graphs mirrors the ways that they would have understood and described themselves. So one thing I didn't mention is that whenever a woman was referenced but not named, we often referred to her then as the wife of her husband, which is how she would have defined herself in most cases. Women had the choice after they would mention their, sorry, all of the French terms are coming back. After they mentioned their first name, they would then say either daughter of maybe Ahmed or wife of Salah. whoever they were either closer to in terms of the men in their family, or whoever was more perceived as more powerful. They would often reference either their father or their husband. And so even though we don't have their first names in many cases, we do know who they were related to. And so we can at least provide that piece of the way that they would have identified themselves. So this is the essential difference with this type of data mining and analysis. It doesn't replicate the imperial ways of knowing as much as possible, but seeks to counter them through historically accurate representations of the actors as they would have described themselves. And I'm curious how this might serve as a model for repairing harms and the construction of both historical and present data sets as we move into the future. So a couple of challenges I want to mention as I wrap up. So as we're trying to either construct or reconstruct archives or data that no longer exist or never existed, there are some challenges in this process. The first is simply access. Do the sources or their proxies exist? Do you have accessibility to the archives, to the source materials? For a number of years, Algeria was inaccessible to pretty much anyone due to war and a lot of upheaval there. This is not uncommon as we watch current events happening today. So can we actually get to the materials? Can we also preserve them quickly enough so that we can preserve some elements of that record? And then finally, as we consider access, do we have the languages needed to decode the documents? So my documents are largely in an Arabic script, either Ottoman Turkish or Arabic. My sources are also in French, Spanish, and English. Now, of those, I know French, Spanish, and English, and Arabic. But with the Ottoman Turkish sources, I need to work with someone else for assistance because that's not a language that I've acquired yet. Then the next piece of this is memory. So how do our findings align with the memories of the related communities? Do the constructed or reconstructed data challenge beliefs in ways that are helpful, or might they be harmful to the community? And how will we handle this? I can offer some examples of this in our conversation if that's helpful. And then finally, interpretation and usage. So one of the challenges that came up as I thought about expanding this project and working with other scholars who study the Ottoman Empire, my naive thought was, oh, wouldn't it be great to create similar data sets for other provinces and other regions within the empire? And as I began to explore this, some scholars in different regions said, well, that sounds great. There might be ramifications for descendants of former Ottoman administrators in some of these territories. And it could be dangerous to release that data and make it openly available. And this was something that hadn't even occurred to me. So I was very glad that I was able to begin those conversations with other experts in the field who know their own regions much better than I do and could talk about also the present circumstances and how that data might be used and perceived today. So that larger project remains on hold until we have a chance to kind of think through some of those challenges and is there a way to do this ethically? And maybe there isn't, and maybe that information needs to remain in the archives where it is and not be gathered together as a data set that's at least publicly available. Maybe we could do that in a private way. I don't know. So these are some open questions, some challenges to this approach that I wanted to mention as we go into our Q&A. And finally, as Torsten mentioned, if you're curious about some of the other methods that I've used for this research, statistics, data analysis, some text analysis and sentiment analysis, I have all of that here in my latest book, Visualizing History's Fragments. It also includes practice data sets, examples, problem sets, as well as tutorial videos. So as you read through, if you're interested in any of the findings that I've presented and want to know more about the methods, provide a short description in the text, but then there are also tutorial videos that walk you step by step through how to do this kind of analysis. So with that, I will open it up to questions.